Welcome to Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. Today, I'm chatting with Fiona Clements, Lisa Orchard, and Darren Chadwick on victimisation and cyberbullying amongst those with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities. Welcome, Fiona, Darren, and Lisa. It's a delight to have you on board.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So before we start chatting about this important topic, I just want to find a bit more background about each of you, where you come from, a little bit about what you're doing, and then why, what that pivot point was for you in terms of your cyber psychology journey and what got you passionate about it. So start with Fiona.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, my journey to cyber psychology is probably, quite a long one in terms of kind of various interests I've had over the years. So I mean, in terms of where I currently am, so I'm currently actually working in eating disorders, an eating disorder service at the moment in the NHS. But prior to that, I was doing my doctorate at the University of Wolverhampton. And I think one of the kind of things that I was excited about Wolverhampton was actually the cyber psychology, because there's not many universities in the UK that focus on cyber psychology. So I thought that sounded pretty cool, pretty awesome. So I was quite interested in maybe aligning my research alongside with the cyber psychology stuff. And in terms of my research kind of overlapping with kind of intellectual developmental disability. So that's kind of been a longer standing interest of mine. So prior to the doctorate, I did a Masters in Health Psychology, where I looked at kind of the experience of informal carers. So particularly carers who are parents of children, and children including adult children, with developmental and intellectual disabilities, and looking at the impact in terms of their well-being and health. To really enjoy kind of working in kind of the disabilities area. And for me, that kind of comes from kind of a personal interest. So my brother's got kind of severe developmental disabilities. So that's kind of where that interest came from. And my father being a caregiver, kind of just naturally, that's where I was drawn to. So kind of coming to Wolverhampton, I kind of saw an opportunity really to combine the two, and looking at the cyber psychology side, which kind of is both Lisa and Darren's interests. So Lisa more in the cyber psychology and Darren on the developmental, but kind of bringing the two together was really exciting opportunity. And looking at kind of digital inclusion, and particularly for adults with in developmental and specifically intellectual disabilities. And I mean, just in general, I suppose my interest in cyber psychology, I think, as someone who is a millennial, growing up, the internet, has been a big part of my life. And I think really seen the benefits throughout life as well. So I think, growing up, it's been such an influence in how I make sense of the world, but also my communications. So I think that's also partly why I was really excited to kind of, as a psychologist, to kind of delve into that area.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Fiona. What about you, Lisa?
Hi everyone. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'm the current co-lead of our research centre in cyberpsychology, which we call CRUW, which is Cyberpsychology Research at the University of Wolverhampton, and I co-lead that with Dr. Joanne. So for me, I guess I fell into cyber a little bit just out of coincidence. So when I was doing my undergraduate, I, Fiona touched on that part of observing the world, and being a millennial, used to use the internet as a teenager, and it was all very new and exciting. And so when I came to do my undergraduate project, I wanted to do something about online communication. And, I spoke to my dissertation supervisor at the time, and the word cyber psychology hadn't really come around then. It was kind of in pockets. So it was more social psychology with this online angle to it. And I ended up doing a project looking at how people with shyness communicated on the internet. So fell in love with that, and then I was very lucky to get a job as a demonstrator, which is sort of a teaching assistant at Wolverhampton, and very lucky in the fact that there were lots of people at Wolverhampton who already had this interest in cyber, again, before it was kind of cyber. So I got to hook up with my supervisors there, so my Doctoral Studies Dr. Chris Fuller there, who sadly moved on from Wolverhampton now, but because we had such a large number of people interested in cyber, to develop the CRUW research group. So it was originally WITS, Wolverhampton Internet and Technology Society, and then over time, as we started to be called Cyberpsychology, we adopted the cyber name.
It sounds a little bit like Dead Poet Society.
Yeah.
I want to be part of that one. Brilliant. Darren, what about you?
I had kind of like a career primarily looking at the well-being and working collaboratively with people with intellectual disabilities way before I ever really started to think about cyber psychology really at all. And I remember kind of early 2000s at some conferences I went to, people were starting to talk about the internet and using the internet for interventions and how people were involved in the internet. And so for the past, like since the 1990s, I've worked with people with learning disabilities. I have a lot of friends with learning disabilities and do a lot of inclusive research with them. But in about 2010, I went to Wolverhampton University and I met Chris Forward, and luckily I was very much his office mate. So we chatted about our two areas of interest, and WITS was in full flow then, and my area was different. And we just started to talk about things, and then we decided to do some research together. So with Caroline, Dr. Caroline Wesson, who's also still at the University of Wolverhampton, we did a literature review looking at the internet and how it was used by people with intellectual disabilities, which is still one of my favorite papers I've ever written because it was fun just finding out about the area. And then I kind of went along with the journey of cyber psychology as a kind of subdiscipline developing and becoming a subsection of the BPS. So, and from that, I kind of realized that it was another area, because one of the things that I've always been interested in is the kind of disadvantage of people with intellectual disability and how they're unfortunately sometimes viewed or not viewed at all within society as important or worthy of note or merit. So I like to combat that with my research. So I like my research to have kind of social meaning. And given how much we now use the internet and like hours and hours a day that we kind of use technology and how reliant we are on it every day, it's really important that there aren't subsections of the world that are systematically excluded from that. So for me, that was something that kind of fitted into my passion for why I do research. So I've kind of carried on since 2010, publishing around digital inclusion of people with disabilities and digital risk. And for me, what's quite important is the support that's provided to enable people to use the internet and to make their own decisions around using the internet and technology in their everyday lives. So that's what my kind of interest is from and sustained till now. And I'm currently doing some projects looking at older people with learning disabilities and how they use the internet and how they engage both in online and offline communities.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm going to have to chat to you again another time about that. So the reason I reached out to all of you and to come on this podcast is because you've just published a research paper on intellectual disability and victimization. But before we get there, Fiona, you become the lead author in this, and this is part of your doctorate that you were doing. So I just wanted to find out a little bit about your doctorate journey, what got you started, what you specifically focused on, and what it feels like to have finished.
Yeah. So I've completed actually in 2022. And it's kind of the publishing process since then, as I'm sure people understand, takes a while. So it took us a while to get the research actually out there. But in terms of my journey, I think so. My doctorate was in counselling psychology, so it's a bit different to a typical PhD in the sense that it's not just 100% research. You have kind of research as kind of 1/3 of the doctorate, and then you have another third which is the teaching and kind of the academic learning side, and then another third which is kind of your practical placements where you're kind of working in the NHS and putting it into practice really. And I think in terms of particularly the research side, I mean, how I ended up in kind of the project that I did is actually down to really Darren and Lisa, because they had an interesting idea, which was around kind of looking at the specific kind of the specific interactions that can occur in kind of behaviors like cyberbullying, and looking at things like flaming. So kind of that, when I say flaming, I mean kind of like those harassing kind of messages that can kind of go two-way between two people. And particularly then in the context of disabilities. So we received kind of a guide of proposed projects if anyone was interested. And I saw kind of the two areas of interest, and I thought, great, this sounds really, really interesting, combining both the disability side, but also kind of more the cyber psychology side. So kind of when I saw that project, I emailed them both, and we met, and we kind of got started from there, really talking about ideas, and kind of from there the project evolved. And kind of that links with this paper that we've published, which was kind of fed into part of the kind of literature review that we did as part of the doctorate, and really understanding the area and the specifics around cyberbullying, and the specific types of cyberbullying that might be experienced for people with intellectual disabilities.
No, thank you so much for clarifying, because I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between a PhD and a doctorate. And that was a really great way of showcasing that. And a PhD, if I'm not mistaken, is mostly research-based, whereas a doctorate's very different. So thank you for clarifying that. But you've finished, and I know it's 2 years ago, but what does it feel like to accomplish this massive achievement?
Do you know, interesting question. Do you know, it feels like a lifetime ago now. I think at the time it was a very challenging journey, and I think particularly because halfway through my doctorate is when we had COVID and kind of the lockdown and kind of the impact of that. So I think yeah, I think when I think of COVID as well, it does feel like a lifetime ago. I think yeah, it was really difficult at times, and I think but rewarding, you know, to have completed it. So I'm really pleased, and also really pleased that I've had the opportunity to kind of continue with Darren and Lisa to get that research out there as well. Because I think when you do a piece of research, and you know, a doctoral piece being such a big piece, you know, you do wonder what the impact will be. So I think it's really nice to actually share that, and to get that information out there, because it feels like it might have an impact, which is really good. But yeah, it's probably not fully sunken, to answer your question.
Fair enough, fair enough. Probably when you're 50 and go, I'm a doctor.
Yes.
I am, of course, I'm brilliant. So Darren and Lisa, I know as supervisors and as academics, you have a lot of things you juggle every day, and quite a number of students you work with. So it takes quite a lot of effort to bring on someone new to supervise. So what is it about Fiona and what she's wanting to study that you went, this is it, she has to be one of my supervisees?
I don't know if you remember this, Darren, but the whole project started on a post-it note, didn't it? So Darren and I were just socializing after work the way that we do, and Darren's always been lovely at looking after me. You know, he's my uncle Darren, and he always checks in with my research. And he was asking how research was going, and we just got chatting about it, and we kind of got carried away. So we grabbed a post-it note and wrote down, let's do a project about this. I mean, we'd put together the paragraph about it, and I think it sat on the shelf for a couple of years before Fiona came along and picked it up. But oh my gosh, we couldn't have asked for anyone better than Fiona, because she just completely took that paragraph and ran away with it. And she was so independent, so passionate about the research. You know, I honestly, genuinely couldn't ask for a better student than Fiona, and I'm sure Darren feels the same.
The answer to a post-it note.
Yeah, it was. And it came out of a kind of, so there's a lot of research that suggests that people with learning disabilities are bullied on a weekly basis, and you were really interested in online bullying of children, weren't you, Lisa? And that's kind of where we just had a conversation about how important it was to tackle that and to address it in a sensitive way. And Fiona really handled herself so well in terms of kind of managing the shift to online and doing online interviews with people with learning disabilities, which is not an easy feat, and just negotiated all that really, really adeptly. Yeah, so she was we're not just saying this, you were an absolute model PhD doctoral student. It was a pleasure supervising you. And the work that you produced was of such high quality that it got published in New Media and Society, which is a really, really prestigious journal. So yes, well done. And yes, very, very lucky for me and Lisa.
So let's talk about the article, and I have to read this because it's quite a long title. So it's a scoping review investigating the perspectives of people with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities on experiences of cyberbullying, victimization, and its subtypes, which was published in Sage Journal in May. So just for clarification, because we kind of use cyberbullying as a generic term, what is cyberbullying and what kind of different types of cyberbullying are there?
Yeah, so I think this is something that came up, Caroline, and as part of the review, is that actually there's so many different definitions out there of cyberbullying, and you know, some definitions kind of traditional bullying has the definition of that's just been taken and applied to online bullying. And then in other cases, there's been specific definitions that have looked on cyberbullying and kind of looked at it as a distinct process and given it a different definition. So I think in terms of the review paper, we kind of went with kind of quite a broad understanding of cyberbullying, just in terms of something that would kind of encapsulate all the different definitions, which was that idea around it's kind of a behaviour online with the intent to cause harm, so kind of via, you know, internet communications, so with, I suppose it's capturing that element that there's an intentional harm behind it.
And in the introduction, there was 3 elements that you wrote about: was online content, online contact, and online conduct, which I'd never come across before. And I just wanted to know if you can, one of you can kind of clarify what it is and how they differ from each other.
Well, it's the work of Livingston and Haddon, I think it came from originally, and they kind of classified in the EU Kids Online study that there were different types of online negative kind of interactions that happened. And so there was online content where people get access to potentially harmful materials online, for example, sexual, violent, or hateful content. There's the kind of contact, which is the focus. Fiona, do you want to take that one because it's the focus of the paper?
Okay. So in terms of online contact risks, so it is kind of risks that occur in a relationship in terms of kind of two or more individuals, and it is kind of a harm that is perpetrated towards someone else, and that person being the receiver of that harm, if that makes sense. So it would be an online contact risk, for example, is cyberbullying, where that person would be cyberbullied. So it's really kind of taking the perspective more of the person who's victimized, if that makes sense, within that risk.
Yeah, and then you've got the harassed and stalked, haven't you? And being groomed would also fit into that as well. And then we have the online conduct risks, which is where the person themselves is actually engaging in behaviour that might be harmful to themselves or to other people. So they're perpetrating the bullying or the harassment or the stalking or the grooming, or they're kind of flaming people online or kind of sending out hateful content themselves and sharing that, or illegal content themselves. And there's also an additional one, which is contract risks, isn't there? Which kind of came up after we'd started the research, which was a new revised thing, which always becomes difficult when you've used a model in research and then they change it halfway through where you've not quite finished. And that's more about kind of negotiating kind of contracts online and signing up for things and getting kind of embroiled in kind of circumstances or with organizations where you might not be able to disentangle yourself, or there might be financial repercussions from that. So yeah, that's the 4th type that we didn't talk about quite so much in the paper.
Okay, that's really great to define that, because I think we so often talk about cyberbullying as one specific thing, and it's kind of like screen time. It's such a generic thing that a lot of people throw around, but there's, you know, we know there's no such thing as screen time, but actually cyberbullying is just such a generic term. So thank you for clarifying those different types and how it affects people, both from the receiving and the aggressor in the process. Fiona, in terms of the gaps that we often look for when we're doing research. And this comes back from that post-it note that Lisa and Darren wrote out. But what was that gap that you saw that you felt needed research? Because that's really how we do research, is we find gaps and then we go find, understand what the research question is, a hypothesis, and then we go research it and find out what the answer is. So what was that gap that you saw that you went, actually, I really need to find out more about this?
Yeah, so the gap was that so gone away, examined the literature, and particularly in the case of intellectual disabilities, and we really found that there wasn't really any research that was looking at the specific types of cyberbullying. So in terms of, we spoke there around the broad types of risks, but actually within cyberbullying itself, there's different types of cyberbullying. So examples include harassment, outing people, so kind of maybe someone's got a secret or something and someone kind of reveals it online. I think cyber stalking comes in as actually a type of cyberbullying.
Briefing, flaming.
So they're the newer ones, yeah. So that they are, so there's briefing, which is kind of in the gaming context where people kind of might kind of sabotage the game for people. The shaming, so kind of shaming people about something. Impersonation, so kind of if we're going online pretending to be someone else. Exclusion as well, so kind of we might go online and as we would in a kind of face-to-face setting, kind of exclude people from things, and kind of that kind of false communication about people and kind of making up information that's not true. So kind of in terms of the gap there was papers looking at kind of online risks really in general, actually, and not many papers specifically on cyberbullying as a specific risk, but then no research on actually then the specific behaviours within that. So really kind of going more into the in-depth and understanding actually, is there differences between the different, the different types of cyberbullying. And quite often the intellectual disability papers would kind of conflate, so they'd both face-to-face bullying, but also cyberbullying. And actually we know there can be a lot of differences between the two types. For example, with the cyberbullying, it can be hard for people to escape, whereas if it's, more traditional face-to-face bullying, the person might have a safe space at home. Whereas actually, the research shows that cyberbullying actually invades the person's entire world, because even at home, they might be experiencing this sort of bullying. So we felt kind of the research wasn't really looking specifically at the differences, and it was hard to tell, was this cyberbullying or was this more face-to-face? And also in terms of the research, it wasn't really looking at intellectual disabilities specifically, but quite often would look at disabilities in general or disabilities in chronic conditions. And what we know from the research is actually intellectual disabilities, there can be differences in terms of their experience, and it's not, one homogeneous population, everyone's different. And it would be really hard, to understand specifically the experiences of those with intellectual disabilities within a real mixed sample, and vice versa for other types of disabilities as well, being in that mixed sample. So we just felt there wasn't really any that looked at the specific cyberbullying behaviours for intellectual disabilities and looked at it within the online context. And that was kind of the gap that we identified in the literature.
Are there specific types of cyberbullying that those with intellectual disabilities experience more than those who don't have intellectual disabilities? And what are they?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of what we found from the review is that harassment did seem to come out as kind of the most common experience that people were reporting. So as part of the review, we really delved deep into understand, when people were mentioning cyberbullying, what did that actually entail? So looking at the specific behaviours involved. And harassment was, as I say, the most common experience. And as part of the discussion in the paper, we went back to the literature out there, and a similar theme actually came out in the literature of those without intellectual disabilities, that harassment does seem to be the most common. However, a lot of the other cyberbullying behaviours weren't discussed. So it might be that those other areas have just not been investigated. So for example, we didn't really find many papers looking at flaming, for example, or the newer forms such as griefing, shaming. So again, that's a gap actually. Is it that these ones are less common, or is it we've not investigated that yet? And kind of more research into those other types of cyberbullying could be helpful.
Yeah, it could be. And that's a great thing about cyber psychology. There's just so much that we still want to learn, and there's so many gaps. So there's so much opportunity for people to do research. So in terms of the cyberbullying and harassment side of things, and the different types of cyberbullying, is there a difference in age with intellectual disability? So are those who are younger, children or adults, experience different types of cyberbullying, or is it harassment across the board?
From the review, and as I say, as quite is typical in the intellectual disabilities research, that there wasn't as many papers as we would have liked compared to those, in the literature of those without intellectual disabilities. So in terms of the papers and what we found, I would say it was quite mixed in terms of the samples. So I was about 50% of the papers were looking at adult experiences, and the other 50% were looking at the experiences of kind of children, adolescents, sometimes mixed samples that might have had, young people and adults. And it seemed to be a similar theme across both, that harassment was kind of the most common cyberbullying behaviour that people experienced. But kind of linking in, I suppose, with what Darren was saying in terms of his current area of research, what we did find is that older adults were really neglected in terms of the sample, the samples used in the studies. So I think there was maybe one study that included older adults as part of a mixed sample, but really I think their voice is missed in the literature at the moment around cyberbullying, and if that's something that is impacting them.
On top of that, I mean, I think it's that intersection of disability and age together that kind of almost creates a double disadvantage for those people with learning disabilities, where they're not necessarily viewed as able to use the internet or technology. So it's just assumed that because they're digitally excluded, they tend not to have that risk in their lives because they're not on the internet, but actually some people are. And I think that's sometimes underestimated and not thought about. And the idea that we have almost like a huge iceberg of people with borderline intellectual disabilities who live in society, who don't have a diagnosis and not in touch with services or supports, but actually will kind of experience some of the same negative interactions online and probably be more likely to use technology.
That's a really good point, because it's kind of slightly milder than mild. They don't feel that they've got it bad enough, or they kind of feel as though they don't want to get diagnosed because it might set them at risk if they go to the employer and say, well, actually, I've got intellectual disabilities. So you talk about harassment as one of the main things that they deal with. What is online harassment in terms of cyberbullying? What does it mean to be harassed? Do you have examples?
In terms of, if I go first with just kind of the definition that we use, so we, I mean, in terms of the kind of taxonomies that are used for cyberbullying behaviours, there's actually it's something that's not really been updated in I suppose the more current literature. So kind of the most, I'd say one of the most commonly used ones that I came across in literature was Willard 2007. But it doesn't include, so a lot of the behaviours we mentioned earlier are part of that, but it doesn't include some of the newer ones. So I think there is probably room for a bit of updating. But in terms of how they would define it, they defined it as kind of so kind of a negative communication directed towards someone. So it might include things such as insults, mocking, making fun of someone, sometimes receiving threats. And it kind of differs from flaming in terms of how they would define it in the taxonomy, in that flaming tends to be a two-way interaction. So there would be the kind of victim might be responding back, whereas in the harassment, it tends to be that one-way communication towards the person who's being victimized.
It kind of mirrors a lot of the offline bullying that people with learning
Yeah.
experience, so being made fun of or being pointed out as different and being targeted and relentlessly attacked as well online. And I think that was one of the worries that, and one of the things that I thought was interesting about Fiona's work was that idea that offline people tend to be bullied in kind of public places like on buses, and young adolescents tend to be the main perpetrators of bullying offline. But actually online, we didn't know who it was going to be and whether it was going to happen to the same degree, but there was that fear that you can't get away from it in the same way because it's online and you often take your technology with you to different places.
Do you think those with intellectual disabilities might have their technology with them more often than those without, or is it just that there is no distinct difference that you can
I know that the amount of use has increased since COVID, very, very much so. And the main kind of devices people have are tablets, from some of the international literature. And a lot of the literature looking at what devices people have doesn't disaggregate people with intellectual disabilities from people with disabilities more generally. So it's very hard to say for sure. So we still need more research on that and looking at what technologies they use, how they use them, and how often. And often they are systematically excluded from the big studies that look at technology uses just by the nature of having an intellectual disability. So that's kind of missing too. But in general, when people have the research that Chris and I had done before Fiona had done her kind of thesis indicated that people often use technology in the same ways as everybody else does. But just slightly differently in terms of needing more support.
So in terms of the research that you've done, Fiona, just both with your doctorate as well as this study and all the other stuff around intellectual disabilities and internet use, what practical application does this have, and how can the general public or those in business or those in NHS use this information?
So if I start with the study first, and then can talk about kind of the doctorate and more general implications. I think one of the key recommendations really, or things that we felt based on literature to date, was that there is differences in terms of the types of cyberbullying, and as I say, the harassment came out as kind of the main one across the papers, but actually more research is needed, particularly into these newer behaviours that are coming up. As we mentioned, griefing, shaming, couldn't find any literature or any studies that have kind of examined that and unpacked is there something that people are experiencing, and kind of what's going on for them in terms of the psychological impact of that. And I think in terms of, why it's important, I think, by knowing the specific types of experiences and behaviours that people are, experiencing, that can inform specific interventions to support people. So as Darren said, it's about supporting people to independently be able to use these technologies, and I think that was a key thing throughout thinking about the wider doctorate, was that people wanted to be online, even being able to facilitate their involvement in my research. It was during COVID, so we had to use Zoom, but actually the reason a lot of the participants were able to use Zoom was actually due to COVID, because it was through advocacy groups. They'd been supported to get online because of COVID, because their main social contact, had been stopped. So they had that individual support to get online, be able to access things like iPads. So I think it's really important, if we understand these sorts of risks and the specific risks, we can support people to manage them. And as part of the research, what came out of those who had experienced these risks, in terms of the rest of the research I did, was that it wasn't always a negative, that people felt, they built resilience quite often, in terms of, they might have had some negative experiences online, but if they had the right supports, and that links to kind of another finding that came out for us, was around supports. And having the right support to navigate those risks if they do happen. So I think it'll inform specific interventions.
I think, no, you've summarised that really well, Fiona, but it adds to the digital literacy information we have generally. I mean, at the moment, we've got all these big arguments, debates about whether we should be banning technology for certain age groups or limiting technology for certain age groups. And actually, it builds on that stuff where if we're too risk aversive and we stop technology, how are we going to teach people about technology? You know, we live in a technological world. We can't just say, let's not use it anymore. So I think that finding is so important just generally around the digital literacy research, to say that actually we shouldn't be too scared of online risks. You know, there's a way to manage it, and understanding people's experiences can help us figure out the best ways to support people to manage these things. Darren, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
I suppose just kind of extending that a little bit in a kind of broader global sense, we've got a kind of, as a country, we've ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. So in doing that, we've said that people have the right to be part of the community, and a lot of our communities are now online. A lot of our interactions and the things that we do every day and the ways that we talk to each other and spend time together are facilitated and mediated by technology. And what we don't want is a world where there's a systematic exclusion of particular groups of people just because they're viewed as more vulnerable, when actually the small amount of literature that does exist suggests that with the right support and with the right guidance and with the right kind of freedoms as well, people can exercise their right to potentially make bad decisions as well as good decisions online, but navigate and negotiate them in a way that's kind of helps them, as Fiona said, build the resilience. And as Lisa said, we can't be risk averse. We can't be exclusionary of certain groups of people because it's inequitable and unfair ultimately. So I think, yeah, that's the kind of the headline for me.
And that's a good point, Darren, because we are living in a democracy, and that's what a democracy is all about, rather than denying certain people certain rights because they have certain characteristics, whether it's intellectual, physical, or mental, whatever that looks like. It's we are democracy, and it's about education and awareness and supporting and giving people tools where there are risks and helping them understand what those risks are. So Fiona, just zooming out slightly, just in terms of now, well, the last 2 years at least, since you finished your doctorate and possibly before, you've been working in the NHS. Are you going to be doing any more research in this area, or are you just finished focusing on your practical work in the NHS?
Luckily, we still have actually some findings that we've not published yet. So we are working on a paper on one of the themes that we've discussed today, which is supports. And understanding kind of, you know, what support is accessed when we might experience an online risk, and kind of what does that look like, and what is kind of the specific sorts of, you know, things that are involved in that support. But also thinking about, you know, from the perspective of people with intellectual disabilities, what kind of support would they like? And really, I suppose, hearing their voices, because quite often, a lot, you know, in the intellectual disability research, a lot of research doesn't actually look at the voices of people with intellectual disabilities themselves. Sometimes it's more from carers or kind of third party, you know, voices that are given. So we felt it was really important to understand actually what is it that the individuals themselves think and would be helpful. So that's kind of one area I'm working on, and a completely different tangent is part of my work in the NHS and eating disorders. So I am doing a bit of research at the moment. I suppose not similar along the lines in terms of inclusion, but looking at particularly individuals who struggle with kind of binge eating disorder and kind of weight shame and stigma. So I'm really looking at kind of inequalities actually within eating disorders, because there is actually a big barrier for people with binge eating disorder to get picked up, in terms of, you know, for it to be identified, but also for them to access services, because of the stigma in society around weight. Because quite often individuals struggling with binge eating disorder might be of a higher BMI, and people kind of miss kind of the underlying psychological distress. So in particular, I'm looking at the evidence around, and kind of with one of the assistant psychologists, around the research around the importance of compassion focused interventions, because a lot of the evidence base is based on kind of more traditional cognitive behavioural therapy, but more third wave interventions bring in compassion, and that's been shown to help with shame and stigma. So it's something that I'm hoping, I know a lot of services in the UK are using compassion focused interventions, but it's not in the NICE guidance yet for eating disorders. So I'm quite keen to kind of improve the accessibility of treatment, but also treatment outcomes for people with binge eating disorder.
So going on to Darren, you've been part of the Wolverhampton Intellectual Disability Network, and your passion is around digital inclusion for people with intellectual disabilities. So why is this such an important focus area for you?
I suppose this kind of comes from when I was younger and I did my psychology degree and I did a placement working with people with learning disabilities, and that led to me doing a module on that, and then PhD looking at older people and their quality of life and their community and social inclusion. And I think as part of that, I realized how people are like very few, like a very tiny percent of people with learning disabilities have paid employment. Very few people have relationships where they get married and they're homeowners, and lots of the things that most people who are typically developing without an intellectual disability have, people without intellectual disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities are excluded from or prevented from having. So that's something I've always been really passionate about. So moving to the digital world, that kind of became the thing that I was most interested in, really, because I spend a lot of time online. Although I've changed from one of those people who use technology a lot and was very good at it to someone who really does struggle with it, just like everybody else does as I get older. So that's a change that's happened over time. So I'm kind of interested in how people with learning disabilities navigate that. And currently I've got some projects that we're doing looking at digital health inclusion of people with disabilities, and also the one I mentioned before, Include Age, that's looking at older people. So I think it's really important because for a kind of, I always think a measure of a society is kind of how it treats those people who are often disadvantaged. And I think a good measure of our society is how well included those people who we might classify as the most vulnerable or the most disadvantaged are treated. And I think people with intellectual disabilities, sadly, are still one of those groups. So that's why I think it's really important. And I also think it's not going to change. So many of our public services are going online with scant kind of thought about how those people without disabilities, sorry, those people with disabilities and older people are going to navigate that change and the supports that are available. So I think that that's an important thing that really needs to be, it's a key societal pressure that's going to carry on as we move forward. How that operates in kind of global majority countries, we have no notion of either. So 80% of all children with disabilities live in global majority countries, but we have very, very little information about the supports they receive, the supports their families receive, or how they use technology and how technology can help them navigate a world where there isn't as much support for them. So there's loads of really fascinating questions still out there. So that's why it's really important to still look into it, and lots of social change that we need to enact so we've got a better world.
And you're currently based at John Moores University in Liverpool.
Yes, I sadly left Wolverhampton University 18 months ago. And I do miss all my colleagues there. It was lovely, but I had to come back to the north to be nearer to family. And I'm enjoying being at John Moores and running my projects there at the moment. It's really fun.
Brilliant. So what kind of undergrad and postgrad options do you offer in cyberpsychology? Because there's quite a few parents and young potential students who are wanting to do cyberpsychology. And as Fiona said, there's so few universities in the UK that offer anything in undergrad and postgrad. So what do you offer at John Moores University?
At John Moores, we don't have a cyberpsychology module at the moment, but hopefully, fingers crossed, in the future, we will be developing a level 6 module for there. There are talk about potential new postgraduate programs, but I'm not sure whether that will be one of them. It's probably better to ask Lisa this, because I think Lisa has much more at Wolverhampton.
But you still are available as a supervisor on specific areas, especially if it's intellectual disabilities.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of projects that I'd really love to do, and if people would love to do them with me, I'd be very happy to supervise people in digital inclusion and disability research.
There are a lot of post-it notes with just a lot of questions waiting to be answered.
Indeed, yes, lots of those.
So Lisa, you're at Wolverhampton University and you do quite a bit of research around social media use and especially uses and gratifications on social media, but you also do research on the role of technology with infant feeding decisions. So why is understanding why people use social media such an important area of research?
I think so. I'll hold my hand up and say I'm one of these people that absolutely love social media. I get so engaged. It's ridiculous how much time I waste on social media. And so part of this question is based on my own curiosities of what it is that draws people in. I think, you know, as a psychologist, there is nothing better than observing human behavior online, because you see the whole spectrum of possibilities from people and how they interact. And I'm also one of these people that has a bit of a tendency to get sucked into all the new latest trends in cyber. So if I go to a cyber psychology conference, I'm sitting there and thinking, oh, I want to try that now, and I want to try that now. So I think social media is one of those that it's so broad that you can dip in and out of different kind of subsections of cyber. But in terms of the infant feeding decisions, you know, again, this is something that's really interesting to me, is about kind of smaller communities online and how different communities interact. And the breastfeeding community online is quite a small niche community, in that, you know, within the UK we have very poor breastfeeding rates. And so I was always interested in how that community forms support online and how that perhaps differs from the offline support that we have. So I think it's just about understanding what it is that social media can offer us. And I'm not really one for the negatives of social media. Yes, you know, I appreciate there are negatives of social media, but there's a reason why so many people love it so much. There's a reason why it draws us in. And that's the great thing about use and gratifications. It's such a positive theory that actually we know what we're doing when we're on social media. We're getting something out of it and we choose to use it, as opposed to being like a slave to technology. So it's just a way of understanding what it is, you know, what it satisfies in us in terms of our human needs. So yeah, just all that kind of introspection of my own usage, I guess.
I only came across the term use and gratification when I was doing my master's, and I think it's great to be able to, as a social media user, think about why I actually use it. What am I spending all this time on social media for? Because we get told off so often about how long we spend on social media without understanding why I'm doing it. And I often use the example of during COVID, because my family's all over the world. It was really great way of me keeping in contact with them. So that was a huge gratification and a great use of social media for me. And I didn't want someone to tell me that I was spending too long on it, because actually this was my little safe space and was my, actually everyone's okay and I feel better about life space. So it's just such a great concept to talk about and let people engage with that in a way of, actually, I do use it for a really good reason. Kind of like what you just said, Lisa, in terms of, I use it and I love it, and this is why I use it. And I'm okay with that.
Well, I mean, I feel like the world would be better if we all had more dog and cat videos, like if we all had more memes and gifs or gifs, or however you pronounce that word. So yeah, I think the internet just offers a lot for us.
Lots more animal videos. I'm up for that. So you are at Wolverhampton University, and that you offer, or it's kind of seems to be one of the main hubs of cyber psychology in England, and where it kind of started in England. So what is it that you offer from an undergrad and postgraduate perspective, and for someone wanting to study cyber psychology?
Yeah, so at our undergraduate level, we have our undergraduate in psychology, and as part of that, the level 6 includes an optional module of cyber psychology, and that's very much a whirlwind tour of what cyber can be. So there's a lesson on social media, on gaming, on online disinhibition and trolling behaviours, on cybercrime. You know, really mixed bag of everything that cyber can encompass. Unfortunately, in terms of our masters in cyberpsychology, we have temporarily shut that down. I'm not sure logistically if that's coming back anytime soon. However, we do have PhD options. So anyone interested in a PhD, you can find out more about cyberpsychology research on our Wolverhampton University website and find out all about our interests within that. And we have the counselling psychology doctorate that Fiona did. And, you know, I think the fantastic thing about cyber is you can dip it across all these different things. So there are so many questions you can ask from a counselling and cyber perspective. So, you know, Fiona shown how to do that with her work, but I've done things like looking at negative content online and how that affects well-being and things like that. So there are lots of questions you can ask if you're interested in doing the counselling psychology doctorate, but dipping your toe into cyber as well. And then also have our online only master's courses. So they are kind of psychology conversion courses, and they will cover kind of optional, I believe they're optional cyberpsychology modules on there. I don't know too much about those, but I know that Alison Attrell-Smith teaches on the cyberpsychology module on there. So yeah, there's lots of different options. If anyone's interested, just get in touch with myself or admissions, and we'll sort you out.
Are there any questions that I haven't asked that you think is just really important to get across now?
The only finding I think that probably should be flagged from Fiona's work from the other paper that she did was the idea that kind of people can stigmatize themselves through the cyberbullying that can happen, and that self-stigma. I suppose it links to your new work, Fiona, really quite close. Yeah. That idea of self-stigma, and it's not just other people bullying you and making you. So the impacts being kind of things like low self-esteem, but the idea that you're being stigmatized. But that can lead to you stigmatizing yourself, and I think there's definitely some work to be done there to try and help people to manage. We like the positives of the social media, but we want to be able to manage and negotiate those negative things at the same time.
I was just going to add, Caroline, that to what Darren said, which was and what we found with that was the actual type of risk was important in relation to that kind of self-stigma. So particular risks were kind of linking and led people to be more likely to self-stigmatize. So for example, if there was a sexual element to the risk, then if we're thinking about society and you know how there might be stigma around those sorts of things, then that was more likely, whereas other sorts of risks kind of felt more acceptable, and it was kind of easier to maybe blame others versus themselves. So I think that kind of adds precedence to the importance of looking at the different types of cyberbullying, the different types of risks individually, because there is differences between them.
Just two more quick questions. The first is, there's a lot of frustration among cyber psychologists around the media misinformation in terms of taking academic research and taking snippets of it and using it in a sensationalized way to foster clickbait and moral panic and basically negative social narratives around digital technologies. Do you think this is getting better or worse?
I'm not entirely sure. I think it's possibly getting worse, and I would place the responsibility clearly at the media and the people who are, you know, proliferating these kind of poorly. And it's kind of it's so sad for the people who've done the research to have their research misused in that way as well. I think it's just, you spend a lot of time doing research, you put a lot of your heart into it, and a lot of time doing good quality research so that we can be certain that we're moving forward in the right direction as a society. And I think people misusing that is not great, especially if it's just to their own political ends. So I think and to push their agenda and to scapegoat. And I think that's kind of a worrying trend that is increasing, especially with kind of populism, I think. So I think it's important for people to be skeptical a little bit and question sources and think about where they're from and have they gone back to the original thing. And I think for us as academics, we've got a real responsibility for making things more accessible and to actually get our findings out in a way that properly represents them to people. But also is understandable to them as well, which I can really struggle with because I really can waffle on as most academics can. So I think it's really important that we learn lessons as academics as well, but that society, we kind of think about the skepticism that's needed around that too.
I think, you know, some researchers have done really fantastic work trying to combat some of the negative media stories. So just off the top of my head, Amy Orban, for instance, has done some great research of trying to break down really good based evidence into lay language that everyone can understand, and thinking about the best ways to get that out to people. So I do think that researchers are perhaps more aware of the problematic nature of the media and the way it can sensationalize things. and perhaps trying to figure out the best way that we can tackle some of those negativities.
In terms of my kind of practice at the moment, I think I probably would be veering towards that. I think it is probably getting worse, and particularly a lot of my job does involve talking about social media. So I think on a practitioner level, we're really aware of it and really trying to intervene. So we've got kind of resources that we routinely share with clients around that, how to use social media safely and to look at things more critically and look at the science. But I spend a lot of my time correcting misinformation that people might read online, or particularly in the current field, myths around dieting and all the things that come with that. And there's so much out there. It's a big business, and actually really presenting people with the science and the right information and helping them to, as I say, use social media in a safe way that's not going to be harmful for them or kind of keep their eating concerns going.
So final question I'll ask everyone at the end of the podcast is, outside of the books, chapters and research that you've written, what is your favorite cyber psychology book that you recommend to others?
The one that I always point people towards is the Applied Cyberpsychology book, which is a bit of a switch because I've written a chapter in it. So it's
That's all right, because you've only written the chapter.
But yeah, the Applied Cyberpsychology book that I think was edited by Chris Forward and Alison Doctoral. And yeah, I think that's a great introduction for people who are really interested in cyber psychology applied to kind of real world problems and real world issues. And it's kind of the chapters are nicely chattily written, so it's quite an engaging book to kind of pick up.
Yes, thank you. Lisa, what about you?
Well, I was actually going to draw on that one as well, because it's a very Wolverhampton centric book in that I, recognize all the names in there, which is always lovely. But there's another one that isn't actually a cyber psychology textbook, but I think it's a fascinating cyber book still. So it's called So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson, and it talks about the anecdotal kind of cases where people have made social faux pas on social media or on the internet, and how as a society we take it upon ourselves to kind of shame these people to bring justice for the community, and how actually normal everyday people can sometimes lose themselves online. So it's quite an interesting read, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, Fiona.
I'm going to go with the Oxford Handbook of Cyber Psychology. Also probably quite a Wolverhampton centric book, but I think it gives a really good overview, I think, of kind of the subject. And I think for me, as someone who, before coming to Wolverhampton was completely new to cyber psychology, it gives a really good, as I say, overview. And particularly it does go into kind of the intellectual disability side. So Darren does have a chapter in there. But I think if you are interested in the interlink with disabilities and thinking about digital inclusion and social change, I think it's a really good book. So I'd say that's a must read for someone who's new to cyber psychology.
And thank you, Fiona, Darren, and Lisa, for joining me on Confessions of a Cyber Psychologist. I really, it's been such a great chat. I've learned so much from this, and it's been fabulous catching up on you in just this quite niche area, but so important and something we really all need to take into account, whatever field that we are currently working in. So thank you for your time, and thank you for coming on Confessions of a Cyber Psychologist.
Thank you.